Hey there, Reconciled Church. Pastor Kevin here, back with another one of these segments we've been doing called From the Cutting Room Floor. If this is your first time seeing one of these videos, basically what it is there is a decent amount of information that I just end up snipping from the sermon for the sake of time and for trying to be kind of laser focused on the main idea, the big idea of the text. And so every week I have some ideas and different things I want to talk about that I didn't have enough time to kind of talk about and share with completely during the Sunday sermon. And this week we're looking at marriage, or specifically prohibitions on marriage, which we find in our passage from yesterday. So if you guys were with us yesterday, you know the passage we looked at. If not, feel free. You can go online and look at what we were studying. We finished out our series on Abraham from Genesis, and specifically looking at Abraham's servant looking for a suitable wife for Isaac, where he finds Rebekah. One of the things I wanted to point out was that there was a really specific point in this story where Abraham says, I don't want Isaac marrying a Canaanite girl. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday, but I wanted to go into it a little bit more. Specifically, like I said, one of the things I mentioned yesterday was that we might see this as being Abraham being racist or prejudiced in some way against the Canaanites. And one of the things I pointed out was the basis for this wasn't the Canaanites' ethnicity, per se. It wasn't by nature of them living in the land of Canaan, but rather it had to do with their faith and their religious practices specifically, which is why the Bible forbade them, the Israelites, from marrying the Canaanites. I mentioned a passage yesterday, which is what I'm really going to dive into more this morning with you guys, which is Deuteronomy chapter 7. Let me read for you Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, in its entirety, and then we'll kind of unpack this. So, it begins, When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons. Verse 4, and this is what I pointed out yesterday. Why? For they would turn you away, or they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus shall you deal with them. You shall break down their altars, and dash in pieces their pillars, and chop down their Asherim, and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a people holy to the Lord. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession, out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. This is the word of the Lord. Okay, so clearly from this passage, the Israelites were banned from intermarrying specifically because of religious devotion. Verse 4, For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Now, adopting polytheism and idolatry was essentially a rejection of God, the God who had brought them out of slavery in the land of Egypt and brought them into this land. This also has to do with Israel's unique role as God's treasured and chosen peoples, which forbade them from doing this. Now, as I mentioned yesterday, at the heart of this issue is the question of who do you worship and how do you worship them? And we still see this danger in our current day and age as well. See, many people would like to marry Christianity with other schools of thought, other philosophies, and other religions. As a result, what happens when we try to do that, however, is that the sufficiency of the Bible is disregarded, and the message of the gospel is also watered down or basically thrown away, discarded completely. Let me give you an example. There was a prominent Notre Dame study, you'll hear me reference this from time to time, a few years back where they did that wanted to look at what American Christianity looks like. And what they found is that most Americans who claim to be Christian actually believed in what the author labeled, and this has become more of a popular term in our day and age, moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a mouthful. What is moralistic therapeutic deism? Well, the basic idea is what everyone who thinks they're a Christian tends to believe. And you've heard it before, you just don't realize you've heard it before. Basically, God doesn't care who you worship, just as long as you know that you're nice to other people and you know that He wants you to feel good. So, God's not that particular about who you worship. He just wants you to feel good and be nice to people. That's the essence of moralistic therapeutic deism. And the idea and the argument of the author of the study, Christian Smith, was that basically there's a danger in that Christianity in America thinks that moralistic therapeutic deism is what biblical Christianity is. Now, the fact that this looks nothing like actual biblical Christianity is the point. Most people claim to be Christian, but what they thought Christianity was bore little to no resemblance to the faith spoken of in the Bible. And so what we see from this example, and there are countless other examples that we find, there are constantly different schools of thought that are trying to basically intermingle with Christianity in our day and age, is how easy it is to believe you are worshiping the Lord, but not really worshiping Him on His terms. Like I said, the two commandments go together. The first commandment tells you who to worship, and then the second commandment, the forbidding idolatry, tells you how to worship God. In other words, you worship the Lord on His terms. Now, what I also mentioned yesterday is that this restriction we find in Deuteronomy should also be seen as teaching Christians not to marry those who do not share their faith. We see, and there's a connection here. We see this connection in the way that the church and Israel are described. Let me show you. Let's compare Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6 with Peter's description of believers in 1 Peter 2:9. Okay? Here's verse 6 from Deuteronomy. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for His treasured possessions out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. Now listen to how Peter describes the church in the New Testament. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness and into His marvelous light. See, Israel was God's special people, the people who God poured forth His blessing on, those who He gave His word to guide and direct their lives as a means of not only blessing and by doing this, they not only received His blessings, but the other nations would be blessed by their obedience as well. Specifically, Israel was meant to be a representative nation before all other nations of the world of this is what it means to follow the Lord your God. Now, as the world saw Israel follow the Lord, so they would be drawn to wanting to worship Him and follow Him as well. In theory, that is, of course. In reality, as we look through the Old Testament, what we find is the people of Israel basically often turned away from God and His law, and as a result, their society crumbled. Now, however, that same role that God gave to Israel in the Old Testament, that role of being His representatives to the rest of the world, is now the role of the Christian church in the New Testament. So what believers are in the New Testament, to some extent, is what Israel was to God in the Old Testament. They are His special chosen people. Now, the question is, we have this law in the Old Testament, how do we handle it? Well, if you recall, and I encourage you can go back, I just put this video out a few weeks ago, I talked about what we call the threefold division of the law. In short, basically what I said is that the Old Testament law, we find three types of laws. Moral laws, like the Ten Commandments, civil laws, like the case laws we find in the Old Testament, and ceremonial laws, which were laws that had specifically to do with the temple and purity and the sacrificial system of ancient Israel. Now, the moral law, we said, is still binding on us. So you still are not allowed to murder people just because Jesus came and died. You are still not allowed to steal from people. Those things are still binding. Christ didn't die in order to create lawlessness, so to speak. However, the ceremonial laws have been fulfilled by Christ. Christ is the perfect sacrifice. And so we no longer sacrifice animals because Jesus was sacrificed in our place. Now, it's when we get into the civil laws that it gets a little bit trickier. And so what the historic belief has been is that the civil laws apply in principle, or as some of the old confessions say, according to the general equity. Now, how should we treat this law forbidding foreign marriage? Well, we see that the issue at hand here is primarily a moral one, avoiding idolatry. You just heard, I got an email apparently, if you heard that beep on the video. But this is also something which applies uniquely to the nation of Israel. So, this is how civil laws work. They are an application of the moral law in a specific context. So, we have to ask, what is the principle at play in this law? What was the principle behind this law? And it's pretty straightforward, I think. It's to love God and worship Him only, and more specifically, to see the covenant of marriage as an expression of that worship. So, how does that law apply into our current situation? Well, if marriage is intended to honor God, and the New Testament draws lines based on faith rather than geographical lines, then it's right to conclude that a Christian seeking to honor the Lord with his or her marriage when looking for a spouse should limit their choices by those that they share faith with. Okay? So, basically, as a Christian, knowing that you are called to honor God and as an act of your marriage should be an act of worship to the Lord, if you're looking for a spouse, you should narrow your choices down to those who share your faith. Now, there's other things that you should narrow your choices down to, but that's probably a discussion for another video. For the sake of time, simply understand a single Christian looking for a spouse should look for someone who is also a Christian. And that's what I believe would be an application of this general principle. Now, that's the ideal situation. The ideal situation is you're a person who's never been married, not married right now, and are saying, who do I look for in a spouse? Okay, first thing, they should be a Christian. However, that's kind of the ideal situation. What if you're a single Christian? So what if you're a married Christian, rather, and you're married to a non-Christian? This could be for any number of reasons. It could be that neither of you were Christians when you got married. One of you became a Christian. Or it could be that you just didn't consider this when you were getting married. Maybe, you just loved the person, you had, had affection for them, and so you went and got hitched. And then you got to a point later on in life where you were kind of taking your faith more seriously probably than you did back then. And the question is, what do you do? Well, one of the reasons the Bible tells you not to marry, this is because let me start over with that. One of the reasons why the Bible tells you not to marry such people is because, regardless of faith, the covenant of marriage is still a binding agreement. Basically, even if you are a Christian married to a non-Christian, under God, you are still in a covenant relationship. You are still married to that person. Your faith doesn't null and void your marriage agreement prior to. So, specifically, one of the things that's helpful is in the New Testament, Paul addresses this. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, you see Paul talking about this issue. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you want to look on your own in a Bible, starting in verse 10, going all the way to verse 16. It says, "To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord," he says, "that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy." Verse 15, but if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. Or how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Okay, so here's the situation. If a couple is a Christian and a non-Christian, or as Paul puts it here, a believer and an unbeliever, then they should remain married to that person unless their spouse abandons them because of their faith. The reason for this is simple. You don't know what God might do. I've seen many couples, as I said, where one person was a believer and the other was a non-believer, and their faith had a profound impact on the other. So, this can happen and does happen, and praise God when it happens. However, understand that this is not a guarantee. That's Paul's point. You just don't know what God's going to do. In one sense, you shouldn't leave your partner because you don't know what God's going to do. God might be using you as a means by which to share the gospel and lead your spouse to salvation. However, if you're on the outside and you have to decide whether or not you should marry someone, he's also saying you don't know what God's going to do. So don't assume that because you marry a non-Christian and you are a Christian that your faith is going to be the thing which leads them to faith. It works both ways, guys. Yes, just as the Canaanites can influence the Israelites' faith, so the opposite can be true as well. However, just a reminder that Paul points out, these things are not certain, and so you shouldn't make decisions based on these uncertainties in life. You should not go into a relationship that you know is going to be difficult from the outset. As a matter of fact, what it seems Paul's saying here is that you shouldn't do this because it's highly likely that this could lead to divorce. This is the context he's talking about. Let's say a husband doesn't want to deal with a wife's faith, and he's a non-Christian, and he leaves her. Or the opposite could be true as well. A wife may not like that her husband all of a sudden became some Christian religious nut, and she might leave him. Now, if they leave and they stay gone, to some extent that's not you can't change their mind. However, you shouldn't walk into that situation in a relationship. So, there's a difference between saying the Bible calls us to deal with the situations and the agreements we've already made, and and saying that, hey, just go get into those situations. So, if you're able to avoid it, best to avoid it. However, if it's unavoidable, you should have confidence in the fact that you don't know what God could do, and you should be faithful in that relationship. Also, guys, side note, I am sure that as I've been reading these passages, there's other questions about other passages in here that I have not specifically addressed. So maybe you have questions about devoting the Canaanites to destruction, or what the holiness of the child refers to in the Corinthian passage. Those are all good questions, and we'll get around to them in good time, but they're just outside of the scope of our current discussion. This is just how life and faith works, guys. Answers often lead to more questions. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue those questions, but just understand for the sake of time, we can only get into one at a time here. Now, one of the things we as a church, as Reconciled Church, are committed to is teaching the whole Bible. And not ignoring the passages just because they're difficult. So in due time, we will address all these passages eventually as well, including the things that maybe arise more questions as you read them. That said, guys, keep studying and reflecting on the Scriptures, and I will see you guys next week. Take care, and God bless.